the 2nd of March, 1943. Bismarck Sea, north of New Guinea. The water was calm until it wasn't. Just above the waves, a B-25 Mitchell thundered in at treetop height, wind screaming past its gun barrels. In the cockpit, Captain Charlie Red Walker squinted through the plexiglass, the glint of sunlight bouncing off Japanese destroyers below. He didn't reach for a bomb release. He didn't call in coordinates. Instead, his fingers gripped the firing switch. He lit them up. 8 forward-facing, 50 caliber Browning machine guns tore through the nose of the aircraft like a flamethrower in the sky. Streams of tracer rounds raked across the ship's deck. Explosions erupted near the bow. Ammunition cooked off. Sailors scrambled and dove for cover, but there was nowhere to hide. The sound of the guns was deafening even at altitude. Down here, it was thunder without warning. Walker's B-25 wasn't like the ones in the manuals. The bomb bay was empty. The Norden bomb site was gone. In its place was something new, something improvised, something deadly. Where glass and aluminum once framed a bombardier's station, now sat rows of 50 calibers mounted nose to tail. Behind him, more machine guns pointed out the sides, the waist, and the top turret. It could fire over 8,000 rounds a minute, and Walker wasn't the only one flying it. The Japanese ships below weren't prepared for low-flying American bombers that didn't drop bombs. These new Mitchells flew straight into danger and unleashed a wall of gunfire so fierce, some convoys never even managed to return fire. To the enemy sailors, it was chaos. To the men flying the B-25 seconds, it was controlled devastation. This was no accident. It was the result of one man's idea, an idea that broke the rules of air warfare in the Pacific. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Pappy Gunn didn't follow doctrine. He followed results. A former Navy pilot turned Army Air Forces engineer, Gunn had grown frustrated, watching American bombers struggle to inflict serious damage against fast-moving, heavily defended Japanese convoys. High-altitude drops often missed. Ships zigzagged or hid under cloud cover. By the time bombs landed, the target had moved. But Gunn had seen something most others ignored. The B-25 Mitchell had more potential than anyone realized. In early 1942, deep in the heat and mud of New Guinea, Pappy Gunn rolled up his sleeves and started cutting. He tore out the bombardier's station. He stripped the nose down to its bones, and he began bolting in. 50 caliber machine guns, first 2, then 4, then 8. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't standard, but it worked. He didn't stop there. Gunn scrounged parts from wrecked aircraft, raided supply dumps for spare barrels, and taught mechanics how to mount guns in side pods and under the cockpit. He used whatever was available: twin mounts, belt-fed feeds, homemade brackets. Each modification was tested in real combat. If it failed, he adjusted. If it worked, he doubled down. Soon, entire squadrons were flying Gunn's modified B-25 seconds. They called them strafer bombers. Their specialty: treetop attacks, low-level strafing, and coordinated runs that turned Japanese convoys into flaming wreckage. The Bismarck Sea mission in March 1943 was the turning point. U.S. intelligence had tracked a major Japanese resupply operation, 8 transport ships and 8 destroyers, carrying over 6,000 troops headed to reinforce Leh. If they made it, the Allied ground war in New Guinea could collapse. Instead, they ran into Gunn's creation. On the morning of the 2nd, waves of B-25 seconds screamed in just above sea level. They didn't drop bombs from the clouds. They raced in with guns blazing. Flying in tight formations, they lined up like dive bombers, but strafed like gunships. The first hits crippled the lead transport. Fires spread fast. Return fire was light and panicked. Within hours, most of the convoy was gone, sunk, scattered, or burning. By the end of the battle, over 3,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. Every transport ship was destroyed. Gunn's gunships had rewritten the rules. What started in a jungle airstrip maintenance tent, with a handful of salvaged parts, had become one of the most effective anti-shipping tactics in the Pacific. Gunn's field modifications weren't just tolerated, they were adopted. By late 1943, North American Aviation began producing factory models of the B-25 Hours and B-25 Jules, both equipped with heavy forward firepower, based directly on Gunn's blueprints. But in that moment, on the 2nd of March 1943, Red Walker didn't know he was flying a legend. He only knew the ship below him was on fire, and his bird had survived. He pulled up, smoke trailing in the distance, and keyed the intercom. That'll teach him to bring a boat to a gunfight. By the time the smoke over the Bismarck Sea cleared, everyone in the Southwest Pacific knew the name Pappy Gunn. But few understood just how far this stubborn, grease-stained pilot had gone to change the way America fought. Paul Irvin Gunn was 50 years old, ancient by pilot standards, and already a legend before the war began. He'd joined the Navy back when aircraft still had open cockpits and canvas wings, later running his own small airline in the Philippines. When the Japanese invaded in 1941, Gunn didn't evacuate. He stayed. He flew supplies. He rescued stranded soldiers. He even helped rebuild wrecked planes in jungle clearings. To the men who knew him, he was half engineer, half daredevil, and all heart. By 1942, when General George Kenney took over the 5th Air Force, he heard constant stories about a crazy mechanic in the jungle who could make any plane do anything. Kenney didn't waste time, he found Gunn, promoted him, and told him to do whatever it took to make the B-25 more effective. That was all Gunn needed to hear. At the base in Port Moresby, mechanics were used to orders, blueprints, and protocol. Gunn tossed all that aside. He worked barefoot in the heat, sleeves rolled, cutting through aluminum with a hacksaw. He pulled out Norden bomb sights, those delicate, expensive systems built for high-altitude precision, and dropped them into a pile of scrap. "These aren't for 20,000 feet," he said. "They're for 200. What he built looked wrong to everyone at first. The sleek glass nose of the BY-025 was replaced with a boxy, gun-studded snout. The bombardier's chair was gone. Instead, belts of ammunition ran along the floor, and side pods bristled with Browning M2s. Gunn even rewired firing circuits himself, connecting trigger lines directly to the pilot's controls so he could unleash every gun at once. On the ground, it looked brutal. In the air, it was revolutionary. When the first test flight roared down the airstrip, observers covered their ears as the guns opened up. The recoil rattled the plane, shaking rivets loose, but the pattern of fire carved a clean line through a row of derelict trucks used as targets. Gunn walked back to the smoking wrecks, picked up a twisted piece of metal, and smiled. "That," he said, "will stop a ship." News of the Gunnows Mitchell spread fast. Squadrons flying out of New Guinea, and the Solomons began begging for conversions. The mechanics called them Pappy Specials. Crews joked that they didn't need bombs anymore, just a full tank of 50 caliber rounds. For the men flying them, these new B-125 seconds changed everything. Missions that once felt hopeless now felt winnable. Instead of skimming waves praying their bombs hit, they flew head-on and watched Japanese ships erupt in flame. The tactics evolved too. Approach at mast height, open fire 1,500 yards out, and don't stop until the deck disappears in smoke. The strafing runs didn't just kill ships, they shattered morale. Reports from Japanese survivors described panic, confusion, and fear of the American fireplanes. And still, Gunn kept modifying. He experimented with cannon mounts, first 20 millimeters, then 37 millimeters. He tested side guns, rear guns, and nose-mounted clusters. When parts ran short, he welded together broken barrels. When the factory said something couldn't be done, he proved it could by lunch. His crew once found him asleep under a wing, oil on his hands, cigarettes still burning between his fingers. To him, the Pacific wasn't just a battlefield, it was a workshop. General Kenney later wrote that Pappy Gunn had more effect on air warfare in the Southwest Pacific than any 10 officers I had. It wasn't exaggeration. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea had shown what these modified bombers could do. But for Gunn, it was only step one. He wanted every bomber in the theater firing forward. Soon, American air power in the Pacific began to shift. Strafing missions, skip bombing runs, coordinated low-altitude attacks all bore Gunn's fingerprints. The once-safe conventional BA-25 became a gun platform so feared that Japanese convoys tried to travel only at night or under heavy rain. Even then, they weren't safe. By mid-1943, engineers back in the States took notice. North American Aviation began designing official gunna-style models, including the BH-25 hours with a 75mm cannon and multiple machine gun mounts in the nose. But the idea had been born not in a factory, but in the mud and heat of New Guinea. One man, a toolbox, and a handful of mechanics had changed the way the Pacific War was fought. And yet, even as his aircraft turned tides and headlines praised his genius, Pappy Gunn was restless. He wanted to push it further, to build something even more devastating. Summer 1943, Jackson Airfield, Port Moresby, New Guinea. The metal was hot to the touch. Under the canopy of a half-built hangar, Pappy Gunn crouched in front of another B-25. He was halfway through converting it again. Sweat ran down his back. Two mechanics handed him a fresh length of wiring. The smell of oil, hot steel, and cordite hung in the air. "Put the next feed line along the right bulkhead," Gunn muttered, not even looking up. This one was going to have 14 guns, 8 in the nose, 2 in each side blister, a top turret, and a tail gun. He called it a gun truck, and once it was done, it would be one of the most heavily armed aircraft in the Pacific. Not a fighter, not a bomber, something in between. Something the enemy couldn't defend against. The crews watching didn't laugh anymore. They used to. Now they lined up to request one of Gunn's conversions. Ground commanders started assigning the strafers to missions first. Pilots fought for them. Bombardiers were retrained. And new gunners had to be brought in just to handle the firepower. But the biggest shift was still coming straight from the top. By late 1943, after the success at Bismarck Sea and continued use of Gunn's B-25 seconds across New Guinea and the Solomons, word of his modifications had reached Washington. The brass finally caught up. At North American Aviation in Inglewood, California, blueprints of the B-25 were pulled from the archives. Engineers gathered around reports sent by 5th Air Force, field notes, gunnery diagrams, after-action photos of Japanese transports blown in half by nose fire. They couldn't ignore it. Gunn's field mods were outperforming factory models. That fall, the B-25G was ordered into production, a factory-made strafer version, officially incorporating forward-facing guns and a 75mm cannon in the nose. By early 1944, it was followed by the B-25 hours, with up to 14 50-caliber machine guns and a better layout for low-level attacks. The jungle-built Frankensteins were now being mass-produced with Gunn's ideas baked in from the first rivet. No one in the engineering department tried to take credit. They knew whose fingerprints were all over it. Back in the Pacific, pilots barely recognized the difference between the old conversions and the new H models, except these had cleaner welds, better ammo feeds, and fewer chances of a jam mid-run. They weren't elegant, but they worked. That's what mattered. One mission in October 1943 made the point perfectly clear. A squadron of gun-modded B-25 seconds was sent to hit a Japanese resupply point near Rabaul, a critical hub for the Empire's operations in the South Pacific. Recon showed fuel depots, truck columns, and several anchored barges hidden under tree cover. This wasn't a job for high-altitude bombers. It was a job for low-flying, high-firepower gunships. At 400 feet, in 2 tight columns, the B-25 seconds roared in over the jungle. Pilots flipped their master arm switches, lined up on the supply roads, and pulled the triggers. The result was total devastation. Barrels exploded, trucks flipped. Japanese gunners barely had time to fire before they were overrun by a wall of 50-caliber fire. One crewman later described it like driving a lawnmower over a string of firecrackers. No bombs were needed. The entire site was neutralized with guns alone. When the squadron landed back at base, ground crews counted the expended rounds. Over 150,000 bullets fired in under 6 minutes. Not one aircraft lost. Not one major system failure. Gunn's configuration had turned the B-25 into a low-altitude hammer, and nothing the Japanese had in that region could stop it. As word spread, more missions followed attack runs on coastal barges, airfields, convoys, and jungle airstrips. In some cases, guns B-25 seconds were even used to suppress anti-aircraft positions before the main bomber waves came in. They were fast enough to dodge flak and deadly enough to clear a path. Even Japanese pilots began to alter tactics. Reports recovered after the war revealed that Japanese convoy commanders were instructed to zigzag erratically and deploy smoke screens if they spotted B-25 seconds, not because of bombs, but to evade the nose guns. These weren't bombers anymore. They were predators. And at the center of it all was one man, still working on the jungle floor, sleeves up, screwdriver in hand. Gunn never patented his ideas. He didn't write manuals. He didn't want a promotion. He wanted results. And with each gun added, each aircraft converted, and each convoy sunk, he got them. But as 1944 dawned, and American forces prepared to push deeper into the Philippines, Gunn was already focused on something more personal and more dangerous. January 1945. Lingayen Gulf, Luzon, Philippines. The radio chatter was a mix of static and clipped urgency. American forces were pushing ashore across the beaches of Lingayen. Japanese resistance was fierce mortars from the hills, machine gun nests hidden among palm groves, kamikaze attacks striking the fleet offshore. But up above, at 500 feet and dropping fast, a formation of B-25 gunships bore down on enemy positions, their engines growling low across the bay. Among them was a plane, with no official tail number, no paint scheme, and no assigned crew. Just a pilot's name scrawled near the cockpit in grease pencil. Pappy. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Pappy Gunn had returned to the Philippines. This wasn't just another mission for him, it was personal. His wife and children had been taken prisoner in the early days of the Japanese occupation. He hadn't seen them since 1941. He didn't even know if they were still alive. Every town he helped bomb, every supply line he helped destroy, brought him one step closer to the people he loved and the country that raised them. By now, Gunn's B-25 seconds weren't improvised anymore. They were official. The new H models and J models had factory-built gun noses, side gun pods, and improved firing circuits. Some even carried 75mm cannons capable of blasting through enemy ships and bunkers with one shot. But Pappy kept modifying them anyway. He believed combat didn't happen in a lab, it happened in motion. Enemy tactics changed fast, so the aircraft needed to change faster. At Clark Field and later at Tacloban, Gunn could be found late into the night with a wrench in hand, working side by side with enlisted mechanics, fitting new ammo belts or adjusting gun placements. He trusted no blueprint more than a combat pilot's report. One pilot said, "You didn't have to request upgrades. You just had to survive a mission and tell Gunn what almost got you killed." Next day, it was fixed. It wasn't ego, it was urgency. Gunn knew what was at stake. The Japanese weren't retreating without a fight. In the Philippines, they were dug in deep in caves, in jungle bunkers, on airstrips defended by flak towers and suicide bombers. High-altitude bombing wasn't going to clear them out, but 14 guns at 300 feet could. In one mission over Luzon, Gunn personally led a flight of B-25 seconds into a known enemy convoy route near Cabanatuan. Intelligence had reported troop movements headed toward the POW camp area, an ominous sign. The risk of hitting friendlies was high, but time was short. Gunn didn't hesitate. Flying barely above treetop level, the modified Mitchells tore through the column. Trucks were shredded. Ammunition trucks detonated into fireballs. Infantry scattered into the jungle, only to be caught by side gunners raking the tree line. One gunner on the lead ship ran out of ammunition mid-run. By the time they circled back, the enemy convoy was gone, smoking wrecks in its place. That same week, American Rangers launched a daring raid on the Cabanatuan prison camp. Gunn had no direct role in the rescue, but his gunships had helped clear the road. Some of the prisoners rescued were civilians, Filipino Americans, missionaries, children. Others, the wife and kids of Lieutenant Colonel Gunn. He met them at a field hospital days later, frail, thin, but alive. For most men, that would have been the end of the story. Time to go home. But Gunn stayed. His fight wasn't over, not until every American bomber in the theater had what it needed to win. He traveled from field to field, working with pilots, refining attack tactics, integrating skip bombing techniques with nose-strafing runs. He even trained Marine pilots on how to fly the B-25 at mast height, a style of attack that most instructors said was too dangerous to teach. But Gunn didn't care what they said. "If flying at 50 feet means you live," he told one pilot, "then you fly at 50 feet." His lessons weren't written down. They were passed from man to man, squadron to squadron. The gun technique wasn't a tactic. It was a culture. Aggressive, low, direct, maximum fire, minimum chance for the enemy to react. By the end of 1945, the Japanese merchant fleet in the Philippines was in ruins. Supply convoys were reduced to night operations in small, scattered vessels. Airfields were wiped out before new planes could arrive. Truck columns were ambushed from above before they could set up artillery. And the B-25 Mitchell had gone from medium bomber to feared hunter not because of a factory design, but because one man refused to accept that good enough was good enough. Pappy Gunn had made his plane personal, and in doing so, he had made it unstoppable. Spring 1945, near Zamboanga Peninsula, southern Philippines. The jungle blurred below as Captain Joe Zorn's B-25 Jules skimmed treetops at 240 miles per hour. The smell of gunpowder still lingered from the last run. Over the intercom, his navigator called out, "Convoy. 4 trucks, 2 with tarps, 2 open. Heading north fast." Zorn didn't hesitate. He banked hard left, dropped the nose, and lined up for another pass. 10. 50 calibers roared from the nose. Side gunners swung into position. The forward blast shredded the first truck. Instantly, flames burst through the cab as it veered into a tree. In seconds, the remaining vehicles were a mess of fire and bodies. All of it happened at under 300 feet. This was the new face of air power in the Pacific. Low, fast, brutal. And it had been made possible by the straight-talking, oil-stained hands of Pappy Gunn. Before Gunn, medium bombers had one job: fly high, drop bombs, and pray. They weren't designed for strafing or close air support. But in the jungles and islands of the Pacific, that doctrine had become a death sentence. The terrain was too rugged, targets were mobile, and the Japanese were quick to camouflage or disperse. Gunn flipped the playbook. He believed in closing the distance. Strike from under 500 feet. Use the B-25 like a flying tank. Suppress with overwhelming firepower before the enemy even knew what was happening. To do that, you needed guns, lots of them, and the discipline to use them precisely. And it worked. By early 1945, the 5th Air Force had formalized what field crews had already been doing for over a year, combining low-level strafing with skip bombing and coordinated fighter escort. Gunn's gunship design was now part of a larger strategy, what crews called maximum surface disruption. Here's how it played out. First, P-38 Lightnings or P-47 Thunderbolts flew ahead to draw fire and suppress known anti-aircraft positions. Then came the B-25 seconds, divided into 2 elements, gunships and bombers. The gunships led the attack. They hit the flak towers, trucks, barges, or command posts first, chewing through defenses with nose-mounted, 50 seconds, and side pods firing into tree lines. Their job was to overwhelm the target, scatter enemy infantry, and create chaos. Seconds later, the bombers followed. Instead of dropping bombs from altitude, they used skip bombing, launching 500-pounders at low level to bounce across water or jungle and explode just above ground level for maximum blast effect. If all went to plan, the target zone would be silenced in under 2 minutes. Enemy response? Almost none. The impact on Japanese logistics was devastating. Convoy after convoy was cut off. Ammunition dumps exploded. Bunkers were destroyed before they could be reinforced. In some regions of Luzon and Mindanao, Japanese forces were reduced to foot travel at night, unable to move trucks or fuel in daylight. One captured Japanese officer, interrogated after the war, was asked about the B-25 raids. He simply said, "They come like a hammer. 1 minute, then gone. Only fire left." American infantry noticed the difference too. Units on the ground began requesting gun runs ahead of assaults. Some GIs claimed they could hear the roar of the Mitchells and knew exactly when to advance because the enemy was either dead or too stunned to fight back. And yet, despite the official adoption of the tactics, Gunn never stopped refining. He kept looking for weak spots, fuel tanks that could be better protected, gun angles that could be widened, tail sections that needed reinforcement. He visited bases personally, rode along on missions, and listened to every crewman who had something to say. He didn't wear stars, he wore a tool belt. In one instance, a rear gunner complained that he couldn't pivot fast enough to keep up with enemy fighters attacking from the rear left quadrant. The next morning, Gunn had already cut and adjusted the mounting bracket. "Try that," he said. "If it jams, I'll fix it again." It was never about glory. It was about keeping pilots alive and putting steel on target. By mid-1945, nearly every major island campaign in the Philippines had featured Gunn's gunships. From Leyte to Luzon, they had broken down the myth that bombers needed altitude to be safe, or that only fighters could strafe. The B-25, under Gunn's vision, became a frontline tool in jungle warfare, and it didn't go unnoticed. High-ranking officers, including General Kenny, credited the B-25 gunship with turning the tide of multiple operations. At command briefings, Gunn's name was often brought up not just as an engineer, but as an innovator of air-ground warfare. Still, he shrugged it off. He'd done what needed to be done. But as the Allies looked to the next step, the invasion of Okinawa, Gunn was already thinking ahead. The terrain would be different. The defenses more concentrated, and the kamikaze threat would demand even more creative firepower. The 1st of April 1945, just off the southern coast of Okinawa. The sun hadn't yet cleared the clouds when Captain Bill Martin's B-25 banked low over a hillside. Behind him, a formation of gunships lined up in tight intervals, skimming the treetops at high speed. Below, Japanese positions dug deep into caves, opened fire with everything they had: machine guns, mortars, even small field artillery. The B-25 shook from the turbulence and shockwaves, but Martin held his line. 2 seconds, the co-pilot called out. Martin squeezed the trigger. A wall of fire burst from the nose. 10. 50 caliber machine guns roared at once, chewing through treetops, trenches, and the mouth of a camouflaged cave. Side gunners joined in, sweeping the perimeter as the B-25 screamed past. In less than 8 seconds, the entire hillside was reduced to splinters and smoke. The mission wasn't over, but the opening punch had landed. Okinawa was different from the jungles of Luzon or the mountains of New Guinea. This wasn't a war of hit-and-run raids. This was a full-scale invasion, nearly 500,000 U.S. troops, supported by massive naval firepower, locked in combat against an enemy that refused to surrender. Every inch of the island was fortified, every cave was a bunker, and every landing zone was a killing ground. It was the most intense, costly battle of the Pacific, and Pappy Gunn's B-25 seconds were there from the start. By now, the B-25 Jules had become a reliable workhorse across the theater. But in Okinawa, the mission changed. Instead of striking convoys or isolated bases, the gunships were tasked with softening inland defenses before the Marines and Army troops advanced. That meant flying in fast, low, and under heavy fire, sometimes over the same target 5 or 6 times in a single day. To meet the challenge, Gunn doubled down on armor plating around critical areas: the cockpit, engines, and ammo feeds. He reinforced the belly of the plane to absorb small arms fire from below. He added redundant fuel line cutoffs, secondary triggers, and fast swap gun mounts that could be serviced in under 5 minutes. Every change was designed for one thing: survive long enough to finish the mission. And they did. One day into the Okinawa campaign, a flight of 8 B-25 seconds under Major Sam Gilmore was dispatched to knock out a command post hidden in the hills near Shuri. The Japanese had dug deep tunnels, used spotters in civilian clothes, and rotated artillery pieces to avoid detection. Gunn's B-25 seconds hit them before dawn. Approaching at 400 feet, the gunships unleashed a wave of firepower that lasted less than a minute. But the effect was staggering. Multiple cave entrances collapsed. Fires spread through the wooded areas. Spotters were neutralized before they could call in reinforcements. When infantry reached the hill hours later, they found Japanese officers either dead or stunned by the sheer scale of the assault. Gilmore's crew didn't take a scratch. Guns upgrades had held. The kamikaze threat was another story. Every aircraft in the Pacific had to adapt to the new suicide tactics, and the B-25 was no exception. Gunn began fitting forward observer windows with blast guards and reinforced nose sections with impact plates. He instructed gunners to rotate watches during flight fatigue, could cost lives when a Zero screamed in from nowhere. In one incident, a kamikaze broke through the picket line and dove toward a transport ship just offshore. A nearby B-25 inches transit saw it and dove with it. The side gunners opened fire, and the pilot maneuvered to intercept. At 200 yards, they clipped the kamikaze's wing and sent it tumbling into the water. It was the first recorded instance of a B-25 gunship intercepting and killing a kamikaze in flight. Afterward, Gunn worked with Navy commanders to assign B-25 seconds as overwatch patrols near landing beaches, an informal role, but one that saved lives. By mid-May, Japanese resistance had hardened. The Shuri Line, a defensive belt across southern Okinawa, became a meat grinder. Air support was constant. Gunn's gunships were tasked with targeting mortar nests and anti-tank positions just hours before infantry moved in. Their accuracy at low altitude, combined with massive sustained fire, meant they could clear out positions without waiting for naval guns or heavy artillery. Every minute they bought saved American lives on the ground. Some days, they flew 4 or 5 sorties back-to-back, reloading in the field, refueling from tankers under fire. Mechanics worked under lamplight with wrenches in one hand and carbines in the other. Crews slept in shifts. There was no rotation, just constant pressure and the sound of machine guns echoing through the hills. And still, the B-25 seconds kept flying. By the end of the battle, over 100 B-25 gunship missions had been flown over Okinawa. Losses were minimal, kill counts were high, and for the men on the ground, the roar of a B-25 overhead often meant the difference between life and death. Pappy Gunn had never worn medals on his chest. But by the summer of 1945, there wasn't a single airman in the Pacific who didn't know his name. Even as the war neared its final chapter, Gunn's focus never wavered. There was one more mission, one more enemy stronghold, one more chance to push his planes and his men just a little bit farther. June 1945. Over the South China Sea, east of Formosa. The clouds broke open just as the B-25 seconds reached their target area, a coastal rail yard moving Japanese supplies inland. Captain Henry Rudd's flight came in at 600 feet, barely above the rooftops. The shoreline flashed past beneath them. Anti-aircraft tracers reached up, fast and erratic. But the formation didn't break. "Open up," Rudd ordered. His nose guns fired first 10, 50 calibers hammering the rail line. Boxcars erupted. A munitions car detonated in a bright fireball, nearly flipping the plane from the shockwave. Seconds later, 2 other Mitchells released parafrags and skip bombs along the warehouse strip. Within 90 seconds, the entire complex was burning. The Formosa raids weren't just another strike. They were the last offensive use of Gunn's gunships before Japan's final collapse. And they showed how far his concept had come from hacksawed nose cones in the jungle to highly coordinated factory-built air assault machines flying deep into enemy territory with impunity. By summer 1945, Japanese forces were stretched thin across every front. Convoy traffic was nearly gone. Air bases were skeleton crews. Fuel shortages, grounded aircraft. Gunn's B-25 seconds hadn't just destroyed targets, they'd destroyed the infrastructure that made targets possible. In Formosa, his gunships now focused on what remained: refineries, fuel dumps, and coastal supply hubs. These weren't random attacks. Each was part of a larger effort to starve the Japanese war machine before a mainland invasion. Gunn's crews flew deeper, longer, and faster. Some missions required external fuel tanks just to make it home. Others had to divert to emergency strips built by Seabees on remote islands. Still, the gunships came in low, struck hard, and vanished before Japanese defenses could organize a proper response. In one case, two B-25 seconds flew solo missions to disrupt a key radar installation near Keelung. The first aircraft took heavy fire and broke off. The second pressed in, firing its nose guns at the base of the tower before launching two rockets. The radar dish crumpled and fell. Both aircraft made it back on fumes. Mission success. Another link cut from Japan's crumbling air defense network. At this stage in the war, air power had shifted towards strategic bombing. B-29 seconds now dominated headlines flying from the Marianas, dropping bombs over Tokyo. But in the lower altitudes of the Pacific's front lines, B-25 seconds were still working, still fighting, and their presence was felt in a very different way. They weren't symbols of overwhelming force. They were tools of precision pain, agile, ruthless, designed to get close and leave scars. More than once, Japanese prisoners described the B-25 as the plane that hunts. No sirens, no warning, just a sudden roar, fire from the nose, and a disappearing shadow. That psychological impact, the fear of sudden, low-altitude attacks, lingered long after the planes were gone. Gunn watched all of this from the edge of the airfields he'd helped build. He didn't take command posts or sit behind desks. He stayed near the flight lines, always checking equipment, asking questions, and sketching on clipboards. Pilots brought him feedback after every sortie. Gunners joked he could identify a jammed feed by ear. Mechanics trusted him more than officers. He had no interest in fame. Even after his family was rescued from the Philippines, even after senior commanders offered him promotions or transfers back to the States, he declined. "These planes still need work," he'd say. "We're not done." What made Gunn different wasn't just his creativity, it was his proximity to the fight. He didn't innovate from theory. He innovated from damage reports, overheard frustrations, bullet holes in wing panels, and crewmen with burn scars asking if the next one could be made safer. And because of that, every B-25 that came off the line a little better, every strafing run that flew a little closer, bore a part of him. In July 1945, with Okinawa secured and B-29 raids pounding Japan, Gunn's role began to wind down. The battles were fewer. The targets were smaller. The gunships had done their job. But even in the final weeks, he pushed upgrades, quick-release gun mounts for faster reloads, reinforced canopies for surviving shockwaves, alternate aiming setups for solo pilots flying without bombardiers. It wasn't about victory parades. It was about leaving something behind that worked. As the rumors of Japan's surrender began circulating in August, Gunn sat on the wing of a Mitchell and watched a formation of his gunships return from what would be one of their last combat sorties. A pilot passing by asked, "Think they'll retire the B-25 seconds now?" Gunn didn't look up. He just said, "Not today." Because until the war was over, there was always one more target. The 15th of August, 1945. Clark Field, Luzon, Philippines. The radio message crackled, and just before noon, Japan had surrendered. Across the flight line, mechanics stopped turning wrenches. Pilots stepped down from ladders and cockpits. Gunners climbed out of turrets and wiped the sweat from their foreheads. Some cheered. Some just stood in silence, watching the Philippine sky as if waiting for confirmation to appear on the clouds. Inside a canvas tent near the edge of the strip, Lieutenant Colonel Pappy Gunn sat at a worn-out wooden desk, surrounded by hand-drawn schematics, empty coffee mugs, and a half-rebuilt gun mount. When the message came through, he didn't smile. He just exhaled and leaned back in his chair. The war was over. But Gunn didn't measure victory in treaties or headlines. For him, it had always been about survival, about keeping young men alive in planes that weren't originally built for the kind of missions they'd flown. And by that measure, his work had paid off. By the end of the Pacific campaign, over 9,800 B-25 Mitchell bombers had been produced. Hundreds had been modified into gunships, first in jungle airstrips by Gunn and his team, then by the factories back in the States. Those gunships flew more than 30,000 combat sorties, hitting everything from Japanese destroyers to jungle command posts. They destroyed or damaged over 2,000 enemy ships. They supported nearly every major Allied ground campaign from 1943 to 1945. and they helped shift the very definition of what a medium bomber could do. Even more important, they saved lives. Infantrymen who might have walked into an ambush were protected by gun runs. Convoys that could have delivered enemy reinforcements were stopped before they moved. Pilots who might have been killed flying outdated tactics were now flying smarter, lower, and deadlier because of Pappy Gunn's vision. After the war, Gunn declined the spotlight. While others received medals and citations, Gunn quietly returned to the Philippines. He briefly worked with Philippine Airlines, helping rebuild their fleet using salvaged aircraft and leftover equipment. It was a natural move. The country had been his second home long before the war started. But his impact didn't disappear. Back in the U.S., military analysts began to study the gunship model more seriously. Gunn's concept that firepower-forward, low-altitude aircraft could serve as fast, precise, close-air support laid the groundwork for future developments. His ideas would echo decades later in aircraft like the Douglas A-1 Skyraider, the A-26 Invader, and eventually the AC-47 Spooky gunship in Vietnam. The philosophy remained the same: bring overwhelming, controlled fire to the enemy quickly and low, and make sure the pilot had the tools to do it himself. Gunn had proven that innovation didn't need a laboratory. It needed urgency. It needed sweat, tools, and the will to challenge what was standard. In 1957, Pappy Gunn passed away from complications following surgery. He was 63. He never wore his full decorations. He didn't lobby for awards. But the U.S. Air Force, years later, would call him one of the most valuable combat engineers of the Pacific War. His name is engraved not just in stone, but in every mission log that shows a gunship saved a ground unit, every after-action report where a B-25 knocked out a flak nest, every time a pilot lived because a machine worked better than expected. The men who flew his planes remembered him best. To them, he wasn't a colonel, or an innovator, or a war hero. He was the guy who made sure their guns never jammed. Back at Clark Field, in the days following the surrender, dozens of B-25 seconds sat lined up in the sunday. Their paint was faded, nose art chipped, turrets open, bullet holes patched with tape. They weren't pretty, but they had survived through New Guinea, Leyte, Mindoro, Okinawa, and Formosa. A ground crewman walked by one of the older models, one of the first gun conversions, and tapped the side of the nose. 14 guns. He grinned and said, "They never saw it coming." The war was done, but the lessons and the legend had just begun. August 1945, Japan's surrender was official. But the impact of Gunn's gunships didn't end with the silence of the guns. Across the Pacific, American units began to pull back, returning home or reassigning to occupation duties. Thousands of aircraft were parked in neat rows at airfields from Guam to Okinawa, destined for scrapping or storage. The B-25 seconds were among them. Some would be flown back. Most would be left behind. But their legacy was already written not in parades or medals, but in the fear they created and the tactics they rewrote. Captured Japanese officers, now being debriefed by Allied intelligence teams, consistently named one type of aircraft that stood out. Not the giant B-29 seconds that flattened cities from 30,000 feet. Not the carrier-based Hellcats that ruled the skies in dogfights. It was the low-flying, thunderously loud B-25 gunships, the ones that strafed convoys without warning, that flew below tree line and raked roads, that set fire to ships before the crews could even react. To Japanese ground commanders, they were impossible to stop. Too fast to shoot down, too low for radar, and devastatingly accurate. They called them shadow bombers, because by the time you saw them, it was already too late. American forces learned just as much. What Pappy Gunn proved wasn't just that you could modify an aircraft. It was that air power needed to adapt to conditions, not wait for approval. Before Gunn, medium bombers had one job: drop ordnance. After Gunn, they had options: suppress enemy airfields, cut down jungle supply lines, support infantry directly, cripple armor columns before they reached the front. These were roles no textbook had envisioned when the B-25 was designed. More importantly, Gunn taught aircrews that equipment didn't have to come from the top down. The best ideas came from the field. From the gunners who ran out of ammo too fast. From the pilots who couldn't turn fast enough to line up a target. From the mechanics who saw where the fuel lines froze at altitude. And from leaders like Gunn who listened, then changed things with their own hands. In the years that followed, the B-25 Mitchell faded from frontline service. It was replaced by faster, more advanced aircraft. But in Korea, and later in Vietnam, many of Gunn's ideas lived on. When the U.S. needed a rugged, low-level support aircraft in the early stages of the Vietnam conflict, they didn't reach for a jet. They turned to the Douglas A-1 Skyraider, a piston-driven beast with armor plating and long loiter time. Its mission? Close air support and convoy interdiction. It flew low. It strafed with multiple 50 calibers. And its tactics echoed Gunn's work 2 decades earlier. Later, in 1964, another aircraft entered service. The AC-47 Spooky, a converted transport plane, fitted with side-mounted miniguns capable of delivering continuous firepower while circling enemy positions. It was a gunship not unlike what Gunn had built out of a medium bomber in New Guinea, with little more than spare parts, wire, and a wrench. Even the legendary AC-130 gunships of modern U.S. operations owe part of their design concept to the original lesson. Gunn proved in 1943. If you bring overwhelming forward-facing firepower to the enemy and fly it right, you don't need altitude. You need nerve, precision, and guns that don't jam. Gunn's legacy also lived on through the people he influenced. Many of his mechanics went on to become instructors, engineers, and field officers. Some joined the Air Force when it was formed as a separate branch in 1947, bringing his ethos with them. Pilots who flew Gunn-modded B-25 seconds carried those memories into their civilian careers, into test programs, even into commercial aviation. They remembered that man on the airstrip in oil-stained fatigues, cigarette dangling from his lip, looking at a half-melted gun barrel and muttering, "We can fix that." To them, Gunn wasn't a myth. He was real. And more than once, they'd seen his ideas save lives. In a post-war interview, General George Kenney was asked what made Pappy Gunn so valuable. He answered without pause, because he didn't ask permission to do what was right. He just did it. That statement wasn't flattery, it was a blueprint. The story of Gunn's B-25 gunships wasn't just about hardware. It was about thinking beyond limits, working through resistance, and building something better with what you had on hand. It was about fixing the problem, while others debated the rules, and doing it under fire, without guarantees, because there wasn't time to wait for a committee. By the end of the war, Gunn had modified dozens of aircraft, but more importantly, he'd modified the thinking of an entire Air Force. And in doing so, he helped win a war. In the years after World War II, thousands of American aircraft were decommissioned, scrapped, or mothballed in long desert rows. Among them were rows of B-25 Mitchells, some with faded nose art, others with the unmistakable blunt noses of Gunn's gunships. To most, they were just old planes. To those who knew better, they were proof of what could happen when someone refused to accept standard issue as the final word. Pappy Gunn didn't invent the B-25, but he gave it a second life. When the war began, it was a high-altitude, medium bomber dependable, but limited. By the time the Pacific War ended, it had become one of the most versatile, feared, and effective ground attack platforms in American history. Not because of some radical redesign in a factory, but because a man in a jungle with a welding torch and combat reports found a better way to fight. The numbers told one story. Over 30,000 sorties flown by B-25 gunships. Thousands of Japanese vehicles, ships, and positions destroyed. A shift in air power tactics that reshaped how future wars were fought. But the personal stories told another. There were the infantrymen who stopped writing goodbye letters before each push because they knew the gunships would clear the path. The mechanics who learned more from 1 week working with Gunn than a year in technical school. The pilots who survived their 50-mission tour because they flew a bird that didn't leave them helpless above the battlefield. And there was Gunn, who never once asked to be a general, who never made speeches, and who never walked away from a damaged gun mount if someone needed help fixing it. In 1946, when the Army Air Forces transitioned into the newly formed U.S. Air Force, doctrine shifted again: faster jets, atomic strategy, high-altitude missions. The B-25 faded out of frontline service, and with it the gunship style seemed to retreat into the shadows. But that style never truly disappeared. From Vietnam to modern special operations aircraft, Gunn's influence continued: heavy forward firepower, rugged designs that could absorb damage and keep flying, and a culture of empowering those closest to the fight to solve problems. It was never about having the best tools. It was about using what you had with urgency, clarity, and purpose. Years after the war, one of Gunn's former mechanics, now a civilian contractor, visited an air museum in Arizona. He stood beside a weathered B-25 Jules with a patched gun nose and asked the guide if this one had seen action in the Pacific. The docent didn't know, but the man did. He pointed to a modification no one else noticed: a handmade ammo feed bracket welded at a strange angle, just under the cockpit bulkhead. "That's a Pappy fix," he said. "We did that in New Guinea." The factory didn't add those till a year later. He didn't take a picture. He didn't tell anyone his name. He just looked at the plane, nodded once, and walked away. Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn never chased credit. But his legacy is everywhere: in the courage of the pilots who flew low into flak storms, in the engineers who ask, "What if?" instead of "Why not?" and in the spirit of every combat crew who trusted their machine because they knew someone like Gunn had worked on it. His story is a reminder. Sometimes the greatest innovations don't come from design boards or headquarters briefings. They come from a man in the mud with a tool belt, staring at a problem that no one else is fixing and deciding to fix it anyway. Not for glory, but so the guy flying tomorrow doesn't die today.